Landon did a great job last week of introducing this broader definition of poverty, this four-phase definition of poverty, if you will: poverty of God, poverty of self, poverty of people, and poverty of creation. Just a broader view maybe than what we've looked at before, and he did a great job introducing that last week, and also the idea that each of us come from a place in our life of poverty in one of those areas at some level, in some form. And so when we talk about the idea of reaching out, we are essentially reaching out from our own place of poverty to try to connect with those outside of these walls, outside of this body, if you will. And this understanding of poverty begins to shape how we approach ministry to those who are in poverty or impoverished, if you will. He also taught us that Jesus came to do so much more than just die on the cross and pay for our sins, but that He came to redeem mankind, that He came to redeem the world. And so when we think about that idea and that concept and Jesus coming to redeem the world, we see examples of how Jesus redeemed people in whatever impoverished state that they were in. And I will tell you that he shared that with us last week. He's got some things to share with us this week, and I'm kind of sandwiching that. And so if there's anything that you don't like that I say this morning, Landon will fix it next week, okay? He doesn't know that, but I'm going to tell him that tomorrow in the office. One of the things that came to mind for me when we were talking about this idea and how we were going to put this together was the word compassion. When that word's used, sometimes we don't know exactly what it means, or we have our ideas of what it means. Some people think of weakness when they think of compassionate people, pushovers. Some people, a lot of us are guilty probably of kind of having an idea of weak or soft people. That's something that soft people do. In truth, expressing compassion towards other people reveals an inner strength, a strength of character. The word compassion, as it's used in the Bible, means to be moved inwardly, to yearn with tender mercy, affection, pity, and empathy. It refers to the deepest possible feelings. The phrase, when we've used it before, moved with compassion, means to be moved in the inner organs. So it's a very deep-seated feeling when we talk about compassion. It has the same idea as our modern expression, from the bottom of my heart, right? And you're going to be seeing that here in a few weeks, the closer we get to Valentine's Day, right? Somebody defined compassion as sympathy coupled with a desire to help. Sympathy means the capacity to share feelings, to enter into the same feelings, to feel the same thing. And so compassion is sharing the feelings of others and possessing a desire to help them in their trouble. It's a drive to do something. It's a drive to feel what they're feeling, to experience on some level what they're experiencing, and then to help them do something about that. And that's what Landon was introducing last week. When we read the Gospels, they tell us about Jesus. They tell us about His great compassion for mankind. He was moved deeply in His inner being by the needs of those around Him. And He handled it in a variety of different ways. I want to talk about that a little bit this morning. First of all, let's look at the origins of His compassion. Why was He so compassionate? How could He reach out to all the people that He did? How could He care about so many different people with so many different problems? What motivated Him to do that? But think about it a moment. And it's an obvious, very obvious answer, but think for a moment about who Jesus is. He's God in the flesh. That's the origin of His compassion. He's not encumbered with a fallen nature. He's not selfish. He's not self-centered. He transcends all the faults and all the flaws that mark humanity. He sees beyond all of those things. In the New Testament, Jesus reveals the exact nature of God. In John 1:18, it says, "No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is Himself God, and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made Him known." In John 14:9, Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I have been among you such a long time, Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. He's holy. He's a consuming fire. He's a God of infinite love and grace and mercy and compassion, and Jesus is the very essence of that. Hebrews 4:16 says, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." It's the essence of Christ. It's the essence of His compassion, of who He is. It's the Spirit then that you and I, in the effort of being Christ-like, that's the Spirit that we need to be operating within. It's the love and the grace and the mercy and the compassion that you and I are called to. And we're dealing with the impoverished. When we approach people with the compassion of Jesus, what happens is that we see people differently. We see people as people. When we approach people and we engage people with the compassion of Jesus, we quit seeing people as projects and we see people as people. We see people as children of God, the same way that God sees people. His compassion also originated in His experiences. One of the reasons that He was able to express such sympathy for others is because of His own experiences in life. He didn't come into this world to live a life of luxury. His life was difficult at best. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9 says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though He was rich, yet for your sake He became poor, so that through His poverty you might become rich." He grew up and He lived and He died in poverty. In Luke chapter 2:24, when Mary took Him to the temple to present Him, from the Jewish custom in the book of Leviticus chapter 12, it said that after a period of time when a woman gave birth, she was to go then to the temple to purify herself and present the child. And when she did so, she was to take with her a lamb or a calf and a dove. But then it goes on to say if that woman could not afford a lamb or a calf, it was okay for her to bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons. When we read in Luke chapter 2, 24, it says that she went to present at the temple and she took with her 2 doves, which indicated that she was so poor she couldn't afford the larger sacrifice. Jesus was born into poverty. Matthew chapter 8, He tells a man that he has no place to lay his head, no place to stay, no place to live, goes from town to town, traveling to and fro. John chapter 19, 23 and 24, when He died on the cross, the only thing He had in His possessions were the clothes on His back, which the soldiers began to cast lot for and divide up amongst themselves. He knew about loneliness. He was despised and hated and rejected. He even endured a time of severe temptation in the desert. And so His capacity and His ability to have empathy and sympathy and compassion on people originated in the things He experienced in His own life. And He connected with them from His own poverty. This is the Son of God. He knew the feeling of pain. He knew what it felt like to hurt deeply, and as a result, He was able to enter into our hurts with us. He's able to feel our pain. And the object of His compassion were people. A brief study of the Gospels reveals the truth that His compassion knew no boundaries whatsoever. Jesus felt the need of all classes, of all kinds of people, in any level of poverty. His love and compassion are a challenge to each and every one of us. He feels compassion for the scattered ones. We read Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. When He saw the crowds, He had compassion on them because they were directionless. It says they were harassed, they were helpless, they were like sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion on them. He felt for them. He had empathy for them. And He wanted to do something about it. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 32, Jesus called His disciples to Him and He said, "I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me for 3 days and have had nothing to eat, and I don't want to send them away hungry or they may collapse on the way. I have compassion on these people. They have a need. They are coming from a place of poverty, whatever that place may be. And Jesus had compassion on them, and it drove him to do something about it. Interesting thing is, so often we see Jesus meeting needs, but not very often do we see Jesus giving handouts. And that's something Landon talked about last week. And we dump in money and money and money and resources sometimes, and handout after handout, and it's not always fixing the problem. It's providing relief, but it's not always fixing the core of the problem, the main need, the core need in their lives. And one of the things we see Jesus do is he looks beyond sometimes the surface need, and he fixes the core need in their life and changes their life, changes the direction of their life in many cases. But nevertheless, he had compassion on them. He feels compassion for the sinning ones. We read in John chapter 8 about the adulterous woman. The Sadducees and the Pharisees brought her before Jesus. They were trying to use her as a pawn to trick them, but they brought her, and they said, what should we do with this woman? The old law says that we're to stone her because we caught her in adultery. And Jesus stood with her, and he said, he who is without sin may cast the first stone. And then he bent down and continued writing in the dirt as he was before. And everybody slowly turned and walked away. And he stood back up and he said, where is everybody? Are they not going to condemn you? And she said, well, I guess not. And he said, well, neither then do I. Go on your way and sin no more. He gave her a message that she could take with her to change her life. Didn't give her a handout, but he stood with her. And he defended her. And then he gave her a message, and I'm hoping that message went further than those few words, and perhaps it did. But there's a message that there's a better way of life. I've stood with you and I've defended you, and there's a better way of life. Go and sin no more. John chapter 4, the woman at the well. Jesus chose to sit with her and talk with her and have a conversation with her, and he engaged with somebody that otherwise no other Jew would choose to do that. She was from the other side of the tracks, if you will. We don't hobnob with them, but he sat down with her and engaged with her and had a conversation with her. And it wasn't a "how are you doing" conversation, "I'm fine." It was a deeper conversation with that than that. And he said, I have a better way for you. I have a better way for you than the way that you're living. And he gently called her out of the way that she was living, and he gave her a message of a new way to live, a new way to conduct her life. And she went away rejoicing, and she went away and she told all of her friends and family, and she brought them all back. Because he had compassion on her, and he chose to sit down with her in a place that nobody ordinarily would have sat down with her and had a conversation with her. And I think he began the process of rehabilitation rather than just offering a quick band-aid of relief. Jesus even redeemed Zacchaeus. And he's on the other side of this spectrum. He was wealthy. He was a tax collector. Nobody liked him because he was a cheat. And he said, Zacchaeus, I'm going to come to your house. We're going to have dinner. We're going to have lunch. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk. And Zacchaeus was so impressed by Jesus and his message that Zacchaeus was redeemed. Zacchaeus said, I'm going to change my life. Zacchaeus said, I'm going to live differently. I'm going to give back everything I took. In fact, I'm going to give even more back than what I took. And he redeemed Zacchaeus. Jesus feels compassion for the sinning ones. He feels compassion for the sick ones. In Matthew chapter 14, he healed the sick of the ones in the crowd as they gathered. In Matthew 20, 30 and 34, he healed the blind. In Mark chapter 1, 40 and 45, he healed the leper, and he told him to tell no one. Jesus wasn't about doing this for himself. He wasn't about this for building a reputation for himself. He wasn't about this for feeling accomplished because he did something to help somebody. He did it because he had compassion on them, and he wanted to redeem them to become what God had originally designed them to be in the first place. And so he told them, the Bible tells him, says that he gave them a strong warning not to tell anybody what he'd done. Now, he didn't listen. He went and told everybody. But it was an indication of Jesus' compassion and what he was about. He was about redeeming people and leading them to a better life. He feels compassion for the suffering ones as well. In Luke chapter 7, we read about the widow who's lost her son. He's passed away, and Jesus sees the funeral procession. And he sees the woman crying and sad, and he felt compassion for her. She was hurting. She was suffering. And she was a widow. She'd already lost her husband. Now she's lost her son. And so out of compassion, he went over and he brought him back to life. He feels compassion for the suffering ones, and he feels compassion for the poor. Matthew chapter 25, and we read that last week as well. At the end of that conversation, he says, when you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. As he told them that, you fed me when I was hungry, and you gave me drink when I was thirsty, and you visited me in prison, and you healed me when I was sick, and you clothed me when I was cold. And they're like, I don't remember that. What are you talking about? And he said, when you do that for the least of my brothers and sisters, you do that for me. But then there's this passage in Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 through 6. John the Baptist had sent his disciples to ask Jesus, now are you really the Messiah, or are we not understanding this right? And Jesus said, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. The good news is proclaimed to the poor. So there's more than we can do than just putting Band-Aids of relief on it. And that's what Landon is began teaching last week. We'll continue teaching next week as well. That there's more that we can do. There's more that we can offer in this idea of redeeming people. And teaching them the good news about Jesus Christ. When we see Jesus, what we see is his desire to redeem people. We don't see him giving handout after handout of relief. We see Jesus building relationships with people in order to redeem them from wherever it is they're at that time in life. Because Jesus, even though he knew all their faults, he knew all their weaknesses, he didn't let that get in the way of his compassion and his expression of love. He saw beyond those things because he saw them as a child of God. He did not look at just what was apparent on the surface. He was able to look at these people and see their deepest need, whatever was down in the core, whatever was causing them to be where it is, whatever it was causing them to be impoverished in that particular area of their life. Because he saw them as a child of God, not as a project, but as people. He loved them at the deepest level of his being, and as a result, he was never impatient with them. He was never offended by their needs. He was patient with them, and he spent time with them, getting to know them, so that he could understand what they needed to be redeemed from. And if we're to be Christ-like in the way that we handle those situations, and we need to take some notes about that. He didn't treat people as a project to parade around and to boost himself and to list it on his list of accomplishments of things I've done this week. He didn't treat them as though their poverty was worse than his poverty. He identified with their poverty. He sat with them in the dirt. He sat with them at their table. And he had conversation with them, meaningful conversation with them. He didn't focus on relief as the answer to poverty. He provided much relief when necessary, but he provided rehab and development much more of the time than he did just instant relief. He saw them first and foremost as children of God. He sat with them, he talked with them, he ate with them, he stood with them, he defended them, and he redeemed them. One of the first things that I tell people when I do 12-step studies with them Because most of the time when they come in to do a 12-step study, they've been struggling with something, usually for a long time. And they have taken that on as their label, as their identity. This is who I am. They'll come in and say, I'm a such and such addict. And I say, no, you're not. Number one, you're a child of God. And generally, most of them look at me like I have two heads. And I say, you're not. That's not who you are. You are a child of God. And you have much more value than that. And that is simply a behavior that we can work to change, that you can allow God to change in your life. And when we begin to see people that way and take the labels off of them, we see them as real people with struggles that we might be able to get in their life and help them with. Not put a Band-Aid on it, but to help them find real rehab or real development that will change their life and get them out of that cycle and out of that situation. And we build relationships with them. And it's through that relationship, just like Jesus, it's through that relationship that we have opportunities then for them to be redeemed. And it's not that we're the redeemers, we're simply the ambassadors of Jesus who is the Redeemer. But how are they to know about Jesus if we're not in their life and having that relationship and spending time with them? And we're going to hear things that we don't want to hear. We're going to hear things that are uncomfortable. We're going to hear things that don't always make sense. As we build a relationship with them and as we spend time and have some conversations with them. And it's going to cost you something that's a pretty high commodity. It's going to cost you some time to sit and do those things. Interesting passage. Jesus approaches a crippled man and he asks a question. And he says, do you want to get well? This is a man who's been crippled his entire life. And his entire life he's depended on somebody to pick him up and take him down to where he was at to beg for money and whatever, and then take him home. He said, do you want to get well? And he said, I don't even have anybody to help me get down into the well that's right there. And Jesus said, get up and walk. And I find that an interesting passage, and I find that an interesting question. But here's the other side of this when we're talking about redeeming people and helping people who are in poverty, is that sometimes people don't always want help, or at least not yet. And we offer, and we work, and we build a relationship with them, and you never know what will happen. I've had a case in my recovery work. We worked for 6 months, working the 12 steps, working the process, doing great. And then that person was just gone for a period of time, a couple of months, I think. Called a few times, made a little bit of contact, but I can't push them if they don't want to do it. I can't force it. And then I get a phone call. And it says, Ryan, I want to come back in and visit with you. And I said, I'm here. And because we had built a relationship, that person came back in and sat with me, and we caught up on what was going on for the past couple of months, and they opened up and they shared about the last couple of months and things that had happened. And we jumped back in to our study, and we finished, and that person graduated the 12-step study. And that person has been worshiping ever since. That person has been free of their addiction ever since. But I firmly believe it's because of building a relationship. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's very cliche. I get it. I know that. But it's the truth. They don't care a thing about what you have to say until they know that you care about them. And we care, but we show that we care by having compassion on the deepest level. We build a relationship by walking alongside them in rehabilitation toward redemption. So how do we see people? We often base our evaluation of a person on what we see with our eyes and what we hear with our ears. What we need to learn is to look past a person's exterior and see them as they really are. First and foremost, a child of God. We must see their needs before we can express compassion to them. We need to learn to see them as Jesus does. Compassion is the essence of the golden rule, Matthew chapter 7. He wasn't the first to say something like that. In fact, the Jews, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and others have been saying similar things like this. For example, the Hindu faith says, "This is the sum of duty. Do not to others, which if done to thee would cause thee pain." The Jewish faith, "What is hateful to you, do not to your fellow men. That is the entire law. All the rest is commentary." Zoroastrian faith, and I don't even know what that is, but it says, "Whatever is disagreeable to yourself, do not do unto others." The Buddhist faith says, "Hurt not others with that which pains yourself." In Greek philosophy, Socrates, in fact, said, "Do not do unto others what angers you, if done to you by others." Now, all of those sound very similar, except for one thing. All of those are negative in nature. But the words of Jesus are positive in nature. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Treat others the way you would have them treat you. And so if we want dignity in life, we should treat others with dignity. If we want respect in our positions of life, we need to treat others with respect, regardless of their position. If we want compassion in our life, then we are to treat others with compassion. And that transcends all positions, that transcends all cultural differences, that transcends all of those things. So the very, very heart of what we're talking about and what we're trying to do comes down to simple golden rules, something we learned starting in Miss Betty's class when we were 2 and 3 years old. And so instead of being here and looking down, let's get down with those where they're at. And let's have compassion for them where they're at. And let's talk with them where they're at. It's God's will for each and every one of us. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2 says, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." And compassion allows us to do that. Compassion allows us to see people as people. Not as projects. Not as something to put on a list of accomplishments. Not as something to make us feel better and pad our statistics. It allows us to see people as people the way God sees people. And when we approach people as simply a child of God, we can engage with them in a way that is meaningful, that is helpful, that is productive, and that is redeeming in their life and probably even in our own life as well. Landon's going to continue this next week. And I'm going to encourage you to be here because it's leading us towards some good things. It's very positive things for the kingdom of God. And so I want to encourage you to be here and hear what Landon has to say and hopefully fix anything that I said that he doesn't like or that you don't like. But that's okay. If you have a need this morning, if there's something we can pray with you about this morning, I want you to share that with us. And if for you, you're at a point where you're ready to put on Jesus in baptism for your own redemption, we want to take the opportunity to do that. If you have a need, please share it with us while we stand and while we sing.
If the name of the Savior is precious to you, if His care has been constant and tender and true, the light of His presence has brightened your way. Oh, will you not tell of your gladness today? Oh, will you not tell it today? Will you not tell it today? If the light of His presence has brightened your way, oh, will you not tell it today? If your faith in the Savior has brought its reward, if the strength you have found in the strength of your Lord, His wisdom has in His palace is sweet, oh, will you not, brother, the story repeat? Oh, will you not tell it today? Will you not tell it today? If the light of His presence has brightened your way, oh, will you not tell it today? Be seated, please.
Good morning. It's certainly wonderful to see everybody here this morning. I have a few prayer requests. Holly